the surface, the novel 50 Shades of Grey by E.L. James is a story about a woman, Anastasia, who falls in love with a young, attractive billionaire who has a dark secret. Grey is interested in owning a relationship that involves BDSM, bondage, discipline, and sadomasochism. The conflict in the book is that Grey wants Anna to be his submissive, while he becomes the dominant. Anna, on the other hand, is not sure what she wants, but it is clear early in the novel that she is sexually attracted to him and starts her own journey of self-discovery into the world of fetishism, sex, and relationships. On a much deeper yet subtle level, the novel depicts not only a corrupted view of God's plan for marriage and sexual relationships, but also vehemently blasphemes the very nature of God. The movie's theme is about the sexual subjugation and violence against women. When the movie adaptation was announced, there were campaigns against the release of the film, asking moviegoers to spend the $50 they would have paid to see the movie towards domestic violence shelters instead. Sex is not the only issue with this movie, but the violence against women that is a central theme throughout. Grey reportedly informs Anna that he has an intense desire to cause violence to her. Counterculture co-founders Gabriella Hoffman and Anna Marie Hoffman said that 50 Shades of Grey gives millennials a poor representation of what true love is all about, as it promotes abuse, narcissism, and misogyny. The coalition against the film further states that the film sets a particularly dangerous example for younger viewers, who may not understand that attractive, charismatic young billionaire Christian Grey is also an abusive sociopath, especially since victim narrator Anastasia Steele continually describes and portrays him as a god. Even Jamie Dornan, the actor portraying Christian Grey, stated that he does not want his own daughter to see the movie. The problem is that Mr. Grey is a sexual sociopath who likes to manipulate, control, and use ritualized sadomasochist sex as a means of getting what he wants. Anastasia is depicted as a young virgin, inexperienced with relationships, and therefore unsure if this type of relationship is something that she wants, yet she is extremely attracted to Grey's charm, good looks, power, influence, and mystique. This book is an attack on God's plan for sexual relationship, built not merely on love, but also one built on trust, companionship, and respect. One might think Christianity condones the idea of a male dominant and a woman submissive with the verse, "Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands, as you do to the Lord." Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22. But St. Paul did not read 50 Shades of Grey, nor has he seen the movie, for later in his epistle he wrote, "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." Ephesians 5:25. Something Mr. Grey does not do nor seems to understand. The novel is truly a distortion of Paul's formula for a holy relationship. Mr. Grey repeatedly tells Anastasia that he is not interested in marriage, nor a long-term relationship, and that he has had at least 15 women in BDSM relationships. But the true intent of the book is not only an attack on Christian values, but on Christianity itself. Mr. Grey is the dominant. On a deeper, more symbolic level, if the color white represents good and the color black represents evil, then Grey would be neither good, white, nor evil, black, but somewhere in between, somewhere acceptable, at least in the perception of Mr. Grey, whose eyes are always described in the novel as being gray. Also in the novel, Mr. Gray often wears a gray suit or a piece of clothing that is gray. In the movie, he wears a variety of neckties, all a shade of gray. Showing Mr. Gray not only dressed as gray, but having a last name Gray is important, as the Hebrew word for name is also character. Mr. Gray's character is in between a purely righteous person and a purely wicked person. Also, the biblical use of color to denote clothing is used frequently in the Bible. For example, Revelation 3:5 and Revelation 6:11 tells us that the saints will wear white robes in the Messianic age when Christ returns, whereas in Matthew chapter 22, verses 1 to 14, Jesus tells the parable of the wedding feast, where the guest is thrown out into outer darkness. But it is Mr. Gray's first name that shows the author's real intent. Even though it is a fact that E.L. James, under a pseudonym, first wrote the story online as a fan-based serial fiction from the popular Twilight series of books, Edwin Collins and Anna Swan's names had to be changed to Christian Grey and Anastasia Steele, respectively, due to a possible copyright infringement. Nevertheless, the choice of the name Christian Grey demonstrates her original image of a powerful, immortal vampire character from the Twilight Saga. The name of the original story was Master of the Universe, an interesting and suggestive title for the main character. This represents the powerful persona which later became Mr. Gray. Mr. Gray's real name is Christian Grey. Naming people in novels is not done haphazardly. Names are not random, especially a name like Christian, that would generate potential backlash from Christian groups. However, it is common knowledge that Christian is a popular name these days, and thus most readers and moviegoers would just think that the name Christian as being of a coincidence and therefore not related to Christianity, the Bible, or religion in general. But what is the author trying to say by portraying a billionaire sadomasochist who likes to dominate, control, and subjugate women through ritualized practices and laws which provide reward and punishment? If his last name is not a coincidence, then why assume that his first name is? Obviously, there's a subliminal message here that Christian Grey is symbolic of either God or the Christian church as a whole. Consider some of what is written early in the novel. Anastasia, the woman Grace tries to dominate in the novel, said, "You sound like a control freak," on page 10. "You are quite a disciplinarianism," on page 68, and a sadist, page 100. Grace's reply, "I'm a dominant. What does that mean?" questions Anna. "It means that I want you to willingly surrender yourself to me in all things." Now look at how biologist Richard Dawkins defines God. The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochist, capriciously benevolent bully. The terminology mirrors that of Christian Grey, who is called a control freak, reacts to himself being labeled gay, and thoroughly enjoys sadomasochistic ritualized sex. This is not mere coincidence. Paul Copan, author of Is God a Moral Monster?, answered the atheist's criticisms. He notes that even though fathers had legal responsibility for their households, including management of inheritance, property ownership, and marital arrangements, women were nevertheless seen as equals. Copan also argued against God as being a person who inflicts pain and suffering upon people by viewing hell as not a place of torture, but of a place of willful separation from God. The common idea of hell we have about an angry God binding people and endlessly torturing them in hell is mostly the product of Dante and has little to do with the biblical narrative. It is true that the Bible does have imagery such as fire and darkness, but nowhere do we see imagery of sinners being burned alive in boiling pits, being torn to pieces, or being cut and ripped apart. Additionally, many believers see suffering, and therefore God's delight in suffering, were certain models of Christ's crucifixion and atonement. With the penal satisfaction model typical of the Reformers, Jesus willingly chose, in perfect obedience, to suffer and die on the cross in order to exempt human beings from the penalty of death the law requires. This model seems to place God as the one who is ultimately responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus. Author N.T. Wright rejects the common teaching that God sent his Son into the world to cause violence upon him through the crucifixion, and that this act of atonement was done to pacify God's anger. Instead, Wright believes the message of God's love for humanity has been forgotten. Likewise, in the novel, Anastasia's punishment seems to somehow satisfy Christian. Mr. Gray also asked Anastasia to sign a non-disclosure agreement and a contract. The contract stipulates many articles concerning the ritualized sexual acts and relational commands of the dominant Mr. Gray and the submissive Anastasia Steele. Likewise, God is also seen as a lawgiver who gave the Torah, the law of Moses with the Ten Commandments, to Moses on Mount Sinai. Like God, Gray wants Anastasia to comply to his commandments. Like God the Father, willing for his Son, Jesus Christ, to have perfect obedience. Christian Gray wishes for Anastasia to have perfect obedience in all things. On page 100. Christian Gray had this to say: I have rules, and I want you to comply with them. They are for your benefit and for my pleasure. If you follow these rules to my satisfaction, I shall reward you. If you don't, I shall punish you, and you will learn. Miss Steele then asks if there would be any sort of relationship between her and Mr. Gray. He replied that there would not be. He never called the act making love, but used another derogatory term, and he insisted that the two have separate rooms and never sleep together. In other words, this is a relationship without there actually being a relationship. It seems that the author is making a comparison between the believer or follower as one being submissive and God being the one with the mysterious past who is distant, powerful, and with a sense of charity. And Mr. Gray does feed children in Africa, as we see in the movie, as well as someone who does not truly love but punishes, abuses, and uses people for his own satisfaction or pleasure. If this is so, then the relationship depicted in the story has no real semblance to either God or God's plan for marriage. In Jewish and Christian understanding, a marriage is made up of a covenant between two people. Rachel Bial, author of Woman and Jewish Law, stated that marriage has two meanings. Either it is seen as having intercourse and marriage was simply effected through sexual relations and cohabitation, or taken in marriage did involve procedure and ceremony, but these were determined by family customs and communal practice. Likewise, St. Paul had a similar statement in his letters to the Corinthians. Do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body? For it is said, the two will become one flesh. And this is 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 16. Even from the beginning, Adam looked upon Eve and said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. Genesis chapter 2, verse 23. This line has been interpreted to indicate marriage even though the first couple never had a religious place of worship or anyone licensed to officiate the marriage. Even though Mr. Gray and Anastasia had an agreement to undergo consensual sexual acts, according to the biblical definition of marriage, they are married. A relationship had been established, although one that is not ideal. In the novel, Mr. Gray insists on a relationship based on a contract, but the terms of the contract do not simulate those of a marriage between two people who genuinely love each other. In essence, the contract stipulates what Anastasia would consider trying. Items included different types of bondage, beatings, and sexual fetishes. This contract did seem unusual to Anastasia. However, throughout the novel, she does seriously consider the offer. The relationship in 50 Shades of Grey can be seen as one of violence against women. But Mr. Gray was adamant on Anastasia's full consent and promised violence that was within her acceptance level of tolerance, insisting that at any time she was free to stop whatever it was that was uncomfortable for her and or leave. What further strengthens the hypothesis of Christian being a representation of the religious experience is Anastasia's name. The meaning of the name Anastasia is resurrection. If Anastasia is a representation of a woman victim and a believer or follower, then there must be some usage of language or imagery which suggests a spiritual awakening or an act of being saved. Indeed, we have two references in the novel. When Christian offers to buy her coffee, Anastasia thinks to herself, maybe he thinks you haven't woken up yet. On page 38, a possible reference to a spiritual awakening. Later, Christian stopped her from going onto the street where a motorist almost hit her. Her response was one of thankfulness for Christian saving her. We can see on page 49. This all might be coincidence, but one may simply look at these details and see a young, attractive man doing what all normal, attractive men do: offer a date and stop people from making dangerous mistakes. But trivial details are usually not trivial in novels. Having Christian save her puts a new status on him. We then see him more of a savior, a divine savior, if you will, someone like God. This also strengthens his charity work and his appearance at her graduation, where he confers upon her a degree. In addition, when Anastasia gets drunk and decides to text Christian, he is just there. In fact, he just appears out of nowhere multiple times throughout the novel. We are told that he is in the telecommunications business and that he has access to data and technology. We also learn that he is a stalker, and we, as a reader and audience member, can get easily creeped out by this. But omnipotence is also a divine quality. Having a billionaire showing up within minutes of a phone call is highly unrealistic, especially if it happens regularly. Does Anastasia go through a resurrection? Yes, most definitely yes. She ultimately does not sign the contract. She keeps her freedom and her honor as a woman. Often the reader wonders how the novel will progress. Will Christian Grey try to hurt Anastasia? Will he attack her in a fit of uncontrollable rage? Or will he change? The end has Anastasia being so physically hurt by Christian that she ultimately leaves him. This breaking off the relationship with Christian also makes sense if we view Mr. Grey as the God of the Bible. Anastasia wants to release herself from her religion. For hints as to this interpretation, Christian tries to convince Anastasia of the ritualized sex act by writing an email stating, "I know this is a huge leap of faith for you," an email in which she calls her epistle. Anastasia calls him a sex god and at one time a controlling sex god during the novel's quote-unquote climax. Also, during the final scene, Mr. Grey plays music while in the act of seducing Anna. He plays La Traviata by Verdi and later plays Spem in Alium by Thomas Tallis. La Traviata means woman gone astray, possibly in reference to Anastasia being tempted by Christian like Eve being tempted by the snake in the Garden of Eden. Yet the piece Tallis is a religious musical arrangement with a choir. The music implies that the sexual act between Grey and Steele is a highly religious one. After the act is over, as well as the subsequent punishment, shame, and pain, another correlation between the novel's climax and the eating of the tree of good and evil, Anastasia leaves Christian, just as Eve leaves the garden as well as God's presence. At the moment, Christian Grey confesses to Anastasia by saying, "I've become alive since I met you," with Anna replying, "Me too." What the reader needs to remember is that Anastasia means resurrection. This resurrection not only applies to Anastasia, but also applies to Christian. Perhaps the point of the novel is not only for Anastasia to leave Christian or Christianity, but to reform it. Anastasia, the real every woman in the story, needs to alter the relationship she has with Christianity, and strive for equal partnership within the marriage. There are countless hints throughout the story that Christian Grey is beginning to change his views. Perhaps the real resurrection is not so much on Anastasia's part, but on Christian's part. Today, many more women are gaining recognition in religious settings. Many denominations are actively trying to correct this by accepting women pastors and spiritual leaders, and Reformed Judaism has accepted women rabbis as well. Although the number of female theologians and seminary teachers have risen dramatically in the past 100 years, Catholicism and most Baptist denominations, as well as most branches of Judaism, still have work to be done in the process of giving women more equal rights, but there is always hope. Perhaps Anastasia is the resurrection Christianity needs. In the end, Anastasia is left more emotionally hurt than physically hurt. It is odd that if her name really represents resurrection, then why is she not well in the end? Here the author suggests that the idea of really being alive is one of suffering, hurt, and loss. Perhaps the real point to the ending is the fact that all relationships have at least one shade of suffering and hurt involved. I believe that the end simulates one's feelings of abandoning one's religion and thus becoming transformed by the experience. Mr. Grey was, in a sense, all Anastasia has ever sexually known. Or perhaps this ending was written so that the sequel, 50 Shades Darker, could be written.